In federal court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia has ruled that artificial intelligence machines can't claim copyright authorship. It upheld a ruling in the case Thaler v. Perlmutter, where the Copyright Office denied Dr. Stephen Thaler a copyright claim for an AI-generated picture. Thaler, who works as a computer scientist, created a generative artificial intelligence and named it the Creativity Machine, which he then used to create his own picture. And on the copyright registration application, Thaler listed that the Creativity Machine was the work's sole author, and that he was then the owner of that copyright. The Copyright Office then denied Thaler's application based on a policy that requires authored works to be created initially by a human being to be eligible for copyright. The judge remarked in her ruling, quote, "The Creativity Machine cannot be the recognized author of a copyrighted work because the Copyright Act of 1976 requires all eligible work to be authored in the first instance by a human being." The judge presiding over that case was Judge Patricia Millett. I believe that the court made the right decision here, and the appeals court held up that decision correctly. If you were allowed to copyright anything that an AI makes, I think you're setting yourself up for a lot of problems down the line. There are a lot of arguments against AI about what it produces and what data it uses to train and what's the legality of that. I think there's a lot of merit to those arguments, although I do think it's a little bit more nuanced than people would like to believe. For example, if I was a musician, I could sit down and really study all of Prince's work. I could listen to all of his albums, figure out how he does everything, and then write a song that very closely mimics Prince's style. And unless that song I wrote really closely copies one of Prince's songs and not just the style of the music, I wouldn't be violating any copyrights. And this is essentially how machine learning works to produce what it does. And so I find it somewhat difficult to reconcile these two arguments. Regardless, this article came up on my phone this morning, and I actually thought it was interesting for a different reason. It reminded me of a Star Trek episode. The Star Trek episode was from Star Trek Voyager and was called Author Author. In this episode, the ship's doctor, who is an emergency medical hologram, not a person, writes a holo novel entitled Photons Be Free. He submits it to a publisher, who then publishes the novel. The novel becomes a hit, but then decides he wants to make edits because of the backlash he gets from his crew and how it paints them in a negative light. The argument comes when the publisher refuses, claiming that because the doctor is not legally considered a person, he has no control over the work he submitted. This leads to a court case about whether or not the doctor has the same rights as a sentient being, and specifically whether or not he has the right to control his intellectual property. I think you can tell where I'm going with this, but when I read the article this morning, I immediately drew parallels to this episode. And I do agree with the ruling of the court, and I think ultimately it's protecting creators and artists and whoever makes work that can be legitimately copyrighted. But I do kind of see the setup for, in the future, that episode to become reality. I do wonder that if AI becomes sufficiently advanced enough so that it is sentient and has the ability to create work of its own, if we will be having similar arguments in court. I even wonder whether or not this specific court case might be used as precedent in the future to deny some sentient AI's creation and ability to copyright its own intellectual property. I think we're a long way off from that, but I can see it happening here. And honestly, the Star Trek episode makes some pretty good arguments in favor of the Doctor, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. But I think this is a fairly complex issue, so maybe sometime in the coming future, we might be having these discussions. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. And if you haven't already, remember to like and subscribe.